humanity obsolete is to note that this AI is specifically a black box, which is to say that the way in which this AI functions is as a consequence of its access to other information, which is to say that it does not think, but rather it is able to determine the relations between other things, which is to say words, and generate more words that it thinks are a sensible word to put alongside this as a consequence. Note that sometimes it gets this wrong. See, this is how sometimes Google Images, when you're trying to do an image search, thinks that croissants look like dogs, and as a consequence of this, there is still some degree of human oversight required, which is to say this is not something that is capable of reducing all labor and making humanity an obsolete overseer, but rather it is simply a tool which we are able to use in order to aid how efficiently we are capable of doing things. And subsequently, what I'm going to prove from opening government and win this debate is two very simple claims. One, analyzing who controls this and why this is likely going to be highly accessible. Two, providing some evaluations over the applications of this, explaining why these are impacts that we probably like. Cool. Who's going to have the capacity to make this? We concede that it is probably going to be big tech because they are probably the only ones who are capable of having enough access to the resources to develop this, the information required to be able to harvest this amount of data, all of the stuff that is required to make this function to any reasonable extent. Why do we think that it is likely going to be quite accessible? A number of reasons. One, given that the only requirement is capital and access to a lot of information, big tech companies that are monopolies in their own industry are now able to compete specifically on this front, which is to say, even if Amazon and, I don't know, IBM maybe don't compete on their usual battleground, specifically in the front of doing a language generation artificial intelligence, they are able to compete because any big tech company is capable of engaging in this battlefront, and they both have the same incentives to extract profit. Secondarily, given that they have the same incentive to extract profit, what they are likely going to be able to do is not only compete with each other on this battleground to try and access maybe different brackets of consumers, different markets of consumers to be able to deploy this artificial intelligence to, but also they want to try and prove that it is going to be useful. And I think they are probably going to do things like lease it out to people in order for them to be able to test it, lease it to different groups in order for them to get a big PR show as a consequence of this, and for them to be able to say that theirs is the best or that theirs is the most accessible. All of these are reasons why they have a direct incentive to try and let people access this. Thirdly, recognize that the market solves, baby, and insofar as there is often going to be a specific niche that is generated as a consequence of there being a demand for consumers to do this, maybe because they can't be fucked writing an email to their boss that night, or maybe because some school kid has homework and wants to try and have to, like, how do you say, like read a bunch of data at once and is able to utilize this instead. Specifically, this means that the market is able to adapt to the niches that are generated by the specific demands. Fourthly, I think institutions like universities and governments are highly likely to subsidize people's access to this insofar as it is also capable of increasing their production output. This is probably something that also extends to employers, meaning that on the whole, given we have proven that a plurality of people are able to access this, our only burden remaining in this debate is to prove that it is something which is likely going to be a good a priori in terms of its applications, and explain why we support it. Cool. Let's characterize who this affects. I think noting the framing that I've provided earlier about the idea that this still requires some degree of human interaction, but it is capable of sifting through a large amount of data at once, I think specifically the people that this applies to is people who are still required in order to perform a job or still have some degree of desired goal that requires a human interaction at the end of it, be this somebody who is researching, be this somebody who is writing a journalist article, be this somebody who is just like, again, trying to send a load of emails and subsequently has a consumer reason to access this, but it still has to be something that is done by them on an individual personal level. Specifically, what I think the applications of this is going to look like is individuals determining that they have too great a workload for them to do it without the assistance of this artificial intelligence, and subsequently they are able to bridge the gap between what human capacity is to do this, and specifically they are able to reduce the workload and reduce the effectiveness, increase the efficiency of it. Why do we think that this is likely going to be something that over time is going to get better at doing this job? Note that insofar as I have framed, there are these companies that are competing with one another who are capable of trying to both be the ones who are going to market this to the most amount of markets, generate the most profit for it, be the person who is the leader of artificial intelligence in this field. Specifically, what this means is that huge amounts of their capital reserves are going to be able to be devoted into it. And noting the framing that there is still a human that is overseeing it, we are going to have some degree of oversight of this. Before I explain why the increase of efficiency and benefits to human lives in this regard is so greater, I'd like to engage with Seal.
Yeah, there's a long-standing issue with this technology being trained on material which is highly toxic and producing biases and pretty awful content. Surely oversight doesn't necessarily get away from that problem.
I think oversight is probably exactly what gets away from that problem. If the person overseeing it doesn't have those bias, which hopefully they won't, otherwise they would just produce the same type of content either way. I think this is probably something that is either symmetric or fixed to the point at which it is oversight. The comparative that happens is, given that they have accessed these biases from reading other pieces of data, specifically it means that if you read the one thing that is biased, you are going to be more likely to be biased than the biases of things being aggregated out across literally all of the data. What do the applications in this then look like, and why is the miserable human life in which we all exist made miles better? One, recognize in academic fields things like publish and perish culture, whereby you have to keep producing output, means that people live lives of an astonishingly poor quality. When you have this ability to increase your production output, this is something that is likely to get better. Two, recognize the same thing applies to journalism, whereby people are often forced to stay up till 3 a.m. producing an article a day just to be able to maintain within the world of journalism and try and follow their dream. Thirdly, I think this is important for things like finance, whereby you are able to access a lot of data really quickly and you are able to immediately make a prediction that is accessible to people and not just a bunch of numbers that nobody is able to understand or digest quickly enough. Fourthly, I think this is important for things like mapping climate change, whereby you are able to access a bunch of data about how weather patterns and stuff are shifting, and you are able to perform a summation in language that is crucially accessible to individuals, rather than just having some colors on a map or shifting of plates that people don't understand. Fifthly, I think it's medicinal data, noting that all of these things and summations are both emotive. They are able to explain whether this is something that is moderate or strong, and it is something that is accessible to people that can direct them to direct policy platforms or a clear fact. I think there are so many applications of this that will mean that we are no longer trapped in the rat race that the Industrial Revolution has forced us all in. Don't let us keep being cogs in a machine, and let us live a better life.
Thank you.
The entire prime minister's speech in this debate is value neutral. The debate is not, all of the reasons he gives are basically reasons why this will be accessible, people will have it, etc. But that's not the part of the debate. We can concede this entire part of the debate. The actual part of the debate is whether or not this technology in its rise and accessibility actually creates good outcomes or bad outcomes, which basically there are a bunch of examples at the end of the prime minister's speech where potentially this could be used in good outcomes. Here are a bunch of counter examples, but also incentives for disassociating. This technology could be used for spreading of fake news and information, like for example anti-vaxxer theories, like for example conspiracy theories, like for example drinking the thing that we wash our hands fixes COVID, etc. Also hate speech, right? Racist things, etc. Rallying up people, doing this sort of thing. So the entire part of this debate is actually whether or not this will be used properly or not properly. This is where our vast majority of our material will engage with them. This is basically how we're going to beat them. So first premise I'm going to analyze, and this is crucial, is to why you're not able to regulate this specific sector or this specific thing in order to deal with the vast majority of the harms, which I expect will come from closing government. There are 4 structural reasons why you cannot regulate. Firstly, notice that people are busy, right? They have obligations like, for example, their jobs, their family. They have limited capacity and time to care about specific issues that they have, etc. But notice that you have status quo bias, right? You're not necessarily thinking about the future. You're thinking about things that are currently pressing and things that are currently problematic right now in the status quo. So these are things like, for example, economic situation in your state. debate, like for example, migration problems, like for example, is abortion legal or not? So you're not necessarily likely to think about this sort of people, get voters to care about this sort of thing. Secondly, many people, politicians and voters simply don't understand this stuff, right? Like it's literally very, very complex to think this sort of thing. Like if you watched the hearings of, for example, Mark Zuckerberg or any other IT big tech guy, and you see the Senate people asking them like the stupidest questions in the world, this is the level to how much they don't understand. But structurally, this makes sense because IT sector has existed for the last 20 or 30 years or has been prominent for this particular thing. So this generation hasn't adapted to these sort of things. But notice second example, even the people at Google, the people at Facebook who create the Google ads generating the algorithms and these sort of things, they too don't understand this sort of thing. Like no one can explain this sort of thing because it's so complex. The structural reason is because it learns from itself. It has vast majority of data, and you're not able to adequately track and understand this sort of thing. So it's not particular this. Thirdly, like big actors with huge money, mainly for example, conservative individuals want to push certain agenda who wouldn't want this particular thing to be deregulated, etc., will most likely lobby against its deregulation, will most likely buy out politicians or pay their campaigns to push this particular thing, or for example, use their traditional mechanisms to do this. But fourthly, even if you don't buy any of this, there are still other competing issues that will be more pressing than this particular thing that are inherent to election cycles, and this will never be a certain thing to talk about because it will be basically politically suicide because you're pushing this on certain agenda. This proves why this won't be regulated, so the vast majority of negative outcomes will be pushed out in these particular things. But second way government can respond, and this directly engages with OGs, but like we can normalize it, right? It can become better over time, etc., right? Here are three structural reasons as to why you cannot normalize this particular thing. Firstly, notice that average citizen, average individual, as per the info slide explains, simply doesn't understand the difference between this text and text written by average human, right? So there is no way for you to differentiate this per thing. But second point, over time, it actually becomes better at lying, right? It becomes more human. The more complex the code, the more money you're investing in this particular thing, which is what Gov supports, by the way, not here in this particular thing. It becomes smarter. It gathers more data. You're able to buy out more data to do this particular thing. But thirdly, and this is very technical analysis, I know in debating it doesn't go this particular way, but notice just the scale, right? The thing learns faster than the humans can regulate it, right? They say oversight, but if the thing is working 24/7 because it doesn't sleep, it doesn't stop, and it adds more codes and more particular thing, you cannot regulate this because it will always outpace you. It will always do this particular thing. Why then will this be structurally used in problematic ways? There are four structural reasons this particular case. Firstly, notice the speed, and this is the OG concedes in this debate. If you're able to push out like vast majority of content that, for example, that talks about fake news, that, for example, talks about race theory, etc., now with this argument, you can put it out faster because it automates all of the things, right? It makes it easier for you to do this particular thing. It means that you can push out more of this content. Notice, incentive for this particular thing is symmetrical on both sides of the house, but now you have greater ability based upon this particular thing. But secondly, notice that AI can specialize in this particular thing that the way that humans cannot, right? Like, firstly, humans are limited by their capacity to understand, to basically you have to sleep. You cannot work all the time, right? But this thing can work all the time. It can specialize. Secondly, it analyzes greater amounts of data that normal human cannot necessarily make conclusion on, etc. So it's likely to specialize in this particular thing, push out even worse content. So not only the quantity increases, but the negative quality of this particular thing also increases. But thirdly, notice the companies that are likely to make this sort of thing, and it's not just big tech, and as OG concedes, they're likely to lease this out to other companies because they will later likely to want to sell out this as an adequate product, will most likely try to make it massively accessible to the end user as possible. So let's say China or let's say Russia wants to buy out this particular thing because you have profit incentive, you give them the best product that you have, right? You basically give them the ability to do this sort of thing. Fourth reason is that most likely it will be used by authoritarian states that have specific agenda that want to pressure their populations or also spread out in different things. But 50, and notice that this is like a big structural problem. This is the most important reason. AI uses data that we have predetermined in the past, right? Things that are this particular thing. The AI is racist, right? The AI basically makes conclusion on things like, for example, Balkan window theory that screws over minorities, on things like redlining, on like statements like, this is not statement that I believe, but statement like 13% of the population does 50% of the crime, right? So the AI is likely to structurally be problematic because of the bad data we have. Before I get to the three impacts, CG.
Okay, so just to be clear, the way this works is like a journalist says, for example, give me 1,000 words on this left-wing argument, or give me 1,000 words on this right-wing argument. It does what people tell it to do. It doesn't form its. I really don't get any of the top half at all.
No. I'm not sure factologically that is the case. I think that's how algorithms work. You have to prove that structurally. Secondly, like as I said, there is a vast majority of incentives to misuse this particular thing. We've given you these structural reasons. The comparative is you increase these problematic things on your side of the house, and people aren't accustomed to this sort of thing, and you can't regulate it. So what are the three impacts? Firstly, during election times, this could be very well the tipping point between problematic things, right? It could sway election with misinformation, with spreading of fake news, like, for example, Biden did X thing, etc., etc., and because people are basically flooded with disinformation and negative outcomes, they'll vote problematically. Secondly, you generally spread out fake news, and people buy this sort of things because it seems to them believable. It's written by a few person, like anti-vaxxer things, like not vaccinating yourself against COVID, like drinking that shit that brings physical harms to you. But thirdly, it's likely to radicalize a bunch of people, right? Because the algorithms push you these sort of things, you read them, you think that it's real, you might most likely become even more problematic, etc., more angry, so you're likely to take up arms in this particular thing. This is a tool that structurally makes sense to be misused, and we cannot regulate it. This is why we regret the rise.
Two, one. Panel, I'm going to start with a bit of direct rebuttal to what we just heard from Leader of the Opposition. Two reasons why this will be regulated. Number one, I think the fact that it gets better over time as people become more used to technology and governments start appointing people from tech probably means that there is a lot of oversight. And secondly, internal market regulation, because previous monopolies compete with one another, talking about what Jason just said. Okay, on how this is potentially going to be used in bad ways, mitigating and mostly washing out everything we heard from Elo. The idea of this being a greater ability because of the speed of it. I think this also applies to people who use it for good reasons. Equally, you could use it to create a summation of data to disproves all of the biases that OO talks about. Bad people are doing this on either side. Either way, they make individuals do this or they just lie. This is the only way in which you're able to compete. Authoritarian regimes have things like sock puppet accounts on either side because the labor cost of them forcing humans to do it is inconsequential to them. Specific utilization of AI to do this instead allows other actors with better incentives to play them at their game. An example of this could be reading a lot of Russian spam bots tweets, detecting the kind of language that they typically use and the stock phrases that are common in them, and very easily being able to ban them because you know who all the Russian sock puppet accounts are, because these data systems are very good at finding correlations within data and then forming a conclusion from them, because they're all essentially a series of functions that just forms connections between different types of speech and speech patterns. They're probably pretty good at detecting this. I think there's also probably an incentive for tech platforms that don't want an oversaturation of poor quality content on their websites, noting that content moderation is already a problem, and it's probably going to be a lot easier for them upon the development of this technology to be able to filter this kind of shit out. Okay, then why bias is not a comparative harm, just taking out all of the rest of Elo's case because a lot of it was just not true. Because these algorithms are generated by the reproduction of data that they consume, and because this operates in a black box manner, i.e. just making associations within functions to achieve some kind of correlation, there's no way it can be more biased than any individual set of sources. On the idea of disseminating things like fake news or racist content, you would require a critical mass of human-generated content to generate new text that reflects the specific biases or the specific type of messaging that you wanted to. It is impossible to manually alter the associations that algorithms make because the number of functions and the impact of individual functions is not known. You can't just amp up the racism level of an AI generating robot because there is no like racism level. It doesn't understand what racism is and it has no logical thinking. Okay, the reason why firms like Google can do this kind of large data gathering is because they have enough data to actually do it that's just generated by people who already use their like platforms. So emails, etc., they can use to train algorithms. They don't have to write the data themselves. If a disinformation campaign wanted to do the former, they would have to create content themselves that reflected the biases or the fake narratives that they wanted to spread. I.e., they would have to write sample text or articles that are like pro-Russian propaganda or pro-racism. Why this doesn't work? Two reasons. Number one, you'll never reach the critical mass of data required to generate something that is actually useful to you. Millions of emails are sent every day by Google that Google scans and collects the data about. Other actors just don't have the capital to generate this. And secondly, if you're going to do the former, i.e. like write or filter out articles or messaging that has what you want, it is just more cost effective for you to just hire people to write this messaging yourself. The only mechanism we were given from opening opposition is like speed and the ability to flood things. You can write your own stuff and flood it symmetrically. This is useless for actors like China and Russia, noting that this is not the same as standard spam bots they already use. Things like Russian spam bots use human written phrases and statements that were crafted for a purpose. They just reuse the same stuff over and over and over. They just say the same things. OO is pretty much entirely symmetric. They're probably out of this debate. Okay, who is providing the AI services? Just rebuilding some of the stuff that Jason already told you. Combination of public funding interests through universities and research institutions, and also corporate interests who have an incentive to become involved in a growing industry, and they have the data required to actually do this. The distribution of this technology therefore looks like the sale and licensing of fully developed AIs as labor-saving devices just to help people do their fucking jobs. Access is going to be good, i.e. non-monopolistic, relatively cheap and widely available because of the plurality of big tech corporations working on distinct algorithms. We require a huge amount of data in order to train these AIs, but there are presently a plurality of corporations capable of doing this. There's Google Cloud, IBM Cloud, Microsoft Azure, Alibaba have one, Amazon have an AI. Insofar as there's a reasonable amount of competition, we can assume prices fall, markets are seized, gaps in consumer needs are filled pretty quickly. Accountability exists through this competition mechanism. If somebody's doing some kind of bullshit, we can call them out and stop using their AI platform. The oversight of government over the development of this technology is quite likely through universities, public grants, etc. It also means that access will be subsidized, probably by reducing R&D costs. Noting this also provides the accountability mechanism over the creation and development of the technology, because academic researchers will be incentivized to monitor for things like biases, so they can publish about it, because we live in a publish or perish baby society. They have no profit incentive to like be invested in the technology and not being criticized, and this already happens all the time. What is this actually useful for? See the black box analogy, combing through hundreds of articles, data, and generating a humanly understandable piece of information from it. Couple of applications. Firstly, in academic research, things like journal articles have conclusion sections where academics will lay out their reasoning of their findings and rationalizing it. It is difficult for one human being to read like 30 articles, and typically if you're going to do an academic review of a big piece of research, especially something like climate change, where so much information exists, it is very difficult to reach a conclusion based off a bunch of academic researchers that are all saying slightly different things, and there's a plurality opinion where there's always some natural divergence. I think this is when you're able to get an overall picture of a simple topic, of a complicated topic, and simplify it into an understandable piece of data. I'll take a peek if I'm closing, quick.
Yeah, how does an overseer detect errors in interpretation if they haven't actually read the source material that the bot is misinterpreting?
Okay, so how they detect errors in interpretation is by improving the technology, because we support the development of the technology. So I presume on our side, the technology is like better and it gets really good over time. I don't mean to be too glib about this, but I'm assuming that this technology actually works, because if you've decided to try and summarize 30 academic articles, and a researcher who probably did read all of these articles, who's like an advanced researcher who's already done these kinds of policy reviews, read them and realized that it was wrong, they would probably just like not stop using it. I don't know. This just seems kind of like a wash. I think what this is also good at is at generating summaries of important topics. This probably looks like things like finance, and especially things that are complicated, like issues like environmental change, because you're able to get an overall summary of a huge amount of information into one thing. This is good for academic articles who are doing researchers, but this is also good for like communication. So people who are trying to write articles about these things to disseminate knowledge to the public. And because these algorithms are so good at generating human text that is understandable by humans and crafted towards a human understanding of these issues, it is probably superior, and it's probably a good jumping off point if you want to write an article about this. It speeds up the dissemination of information. We get a better ability to review articles and stuff. It saves a lot of time for researchers who can do better fucking things. For all of these reasons, so proud to propose.
Thank you to the Deputy Prime Minister.
So you see, this AI is pretty much an EPL speaker, right? Because it has two very big things, which is it's able to say a lot of stuff without exactly explaining to you why those are the conclusion. And it gives it with such authority that you don't really start to question it, especially in terms of the quality of the content itself. I think that these are two structural reasons that pretty much explain to you why this is problematic and why this can be misused. And in terms of the comparative, what we need to do in order to win this debate is pretty simple. I'm going to explain to you and mitigate to a large extent the impacts on why this is going to be used in a good way. But second of all, and I want you to remember this when you deliberate, is that Rumen calls them out on the fact that all of the benefits that they assume actually rely on the incentives of companies and different actors in the world to actually do good. E.g., in this case, even if academics are going to have much better climate change reviews or whatever, why do people and actors in the world have an incentive to use these things and actually implement policies and things like that? So to the extent in which they don't prove to you things like this, which essentially is why the information will be used in a good way, their impacts are pretty minimal to the extent in which we prove to you and we give you actual incentive mechanism as to why there are incentives for actors to misuse it on a much larger scale. I'm going to get into this comparative a bit later. But look, their main response to this is, but actually data is neutral, right? It's not subjective, but this is completely not true. Like saying one data is pretty much always gonna be worse than two pieces of data is a misrepresentation of what data really is, because data in itself represents the biases that exist in our societies. Notice this, the data that we have is not cumulative for all over the world or even for all over our country. In many cases, it's only data mostly from, for example, Western countries. In many cases, this is data that is sexist in a way, which is selected from, for example, specific types of industries where there's a lot of men, or specific types of of academic reviews, which are done by rich white men 100 or 50 years or 20 years ago, or things like that. This basically explains to you that you can't just give an answer to the extent in which, like, obviously this is going to be better and we have biased data on our side of the house, because what they concede is that this is a very good tool to basically explain stuff to people and to basically analyze information, which makes it so that there is an actual comparative in terms of volume and quality of persuasiveness that these mechanisms are able to direct towards people. So to the extent in which they're able to do those things, and the data that they use is likely to say things such as, for example, 90% of crime is actually done in the United States is done by 50% African Americans or whatever. These are things that exist. These are things that data can show you, but it can never explain to you why exactly this is problematic. And this is even worse in the case in which a school kid writes a report or an article is being placed about somebody, and they never respond to the reasons Rumen gives you as to why you're unable to actually make sure that this AI is stopped and is not biased in these particular ways. Because it's not only about how, first of all, like, they're problematic actors in terms of media, right? Like, for example, Russia Today in the United States, Al Jazeera in some cases, and other places like that. So to the extent in which you're able to use this mechanism to get more arguments on your site and more content that supports your point of view, this is problematic on its own. But you can also just make them go wild in terms of Russian spam bots. Because look, the response is, but there's already Russian spam bots. Our point is, these are Russian spam bots on steroids, right? They're much better. And what happens on your side of the house is that states such as Russia are able to co-opt the technologies of big tech, which is the only one able to create such a good technology in the first place, and use them for very problematic purposes. They can do things such as reverse engineer Google's algorithms and things like that, and actually apply them to the situations that they want to use them. So we don't welcome people continuously developing. And our burden is not to prove to you that there's not going to be problems on our side on other side of the house, but we prove to you that to the extent in which this is welcomed, this rise is welcomed, we get much faster to the problematic context in which Russia or China or other bad actors can actually take advantage of these technologies, because currently they cannot develop them completely on themselves because they lack the infrastructure, they lack the resources. This is why they usually steal a lot of text from Silicon Valley, such as because they don't care about IP laws, for example, phones, other types of data collecting tools, and different things like that. This is just worse on their side of the house, and they just cannot get away by saying this is going to be developed anyway. Before I continue, I'm going to take closing.
Your case is completely symmetrical, because if Russia can use this to produce like really bad writing, it seems like movements that debaters like can use this to produce really good writing that advocates for minority rights or something. There's absolutely no reason you've given that this would be used more in bad cases than good ones.
No, actually, we prove to you why this is extremely problematic. And you can't just say, oh, we're going to push leftist content, because this is exactly the problem that we're trying to explain to you, that this completely gets out of the debate in terms of like the ability of one particular NGO somewhere in the United States versus Russian or Chinese government and its resources. I think this is completely non-symmetrical on that level. But I think that in terms of all of their benefits, in terms of medical, climate change, or whatever, like results are not data collection. So they're just in the best case kind of using the data that already exists and trying to say, oh, maybe we can use this or this, but they never really explain to you how we can exactly use this data to promote these things. But second of all, like faster is not better. In many of the cases, even if we have these assumptions, we have to still prove them. We have to involve a lot of resources in order to develop the said technology or to implement said policies or even get political capital for the said policies. And thirdly, like we can do this in many of the cases without AI, such as, for example, employing consulting firms or employing business intelligence analysts or things like that. So I'm not sure to what extent this is extremely important for the context of the debate. And look, in terms of like saying Google emails or things like that, this is another problem that we have, like in terms of scammers, for example, are easily able to co-opt such technology and attack people with it. And it's extremely problematic to the extent in which they can tailor it as to be more persuasive towards people and make them believe that, for example, their mother is actually dying, so they have to send money. We're very proud to oppose this one.
All right. This top half was genuinely like one of the most confusing and weird debates I have seen in a long time. So let's just take a minute to clarify what this technology actually does, because both top half teams seem to miss it. This is AI that can produce writing. Like you can tell the AI, for example, give me a fantasy novel, give me a manual on how to build a car, and the AI will do that for you. So how do both top half teams miss this and run a bunch of impacts that don't really have much to do with this? OG seems to think that this is an AI that can process a bunch of data and find patterns. So OG talks about like being able to identify Russian spam bots or like understanding climate change better. But the thing is, like, an AI that can process lots of data and find patterns is separate from the motion. I agree that AI can do that, but we're talking specifically about language generating AI. And so OG's benefits about like understanding climate change better or identifying Russian spam bots better are outside of the debate. I'm not saying OG completely misses it. Like I think the parts about like summarizing some of this data maybe still stand, but I think OG's benefits are very minor compared to the more tailored benefits that CG is going to give you. So OO, I genuinely have no idea what OO even thinks this technology does. Like it becomes a little more clear in DLO, but I really don't even know what LO thinks is happening in this debate. They seem to think that either the AI will just randomly release text into this world, or that for some reason only powerful actors will be able to use this. So like, I genuinely don't know why they talk about how it's hard to regulate, like as if like it's going to produce lots of text and the only way to stop it would be to regulate it. And now they have proved that we can't do that. Like, no, like someone has a tool that allows them to generate text using AI, and they can say, produce me a text under XYZ parameters. So if Russia can use it to produce bad propaganda, then an NGO can use it to produce good articles. Like I really don't know what OO's case was even supposed to be. Let's talk about where the actual delta in this debate is, because obviously, if Russia wants to release propaganda, it can currently just hire people to write it already, and same with the NGO, for example. What this actually does is, firstly, it makes it much easier to produce writing at all, so you no longer have to hire people to write it and then wait the several days or even months, if it's a long piece of writing, that it would take for them to write them that thing. You can have a computer do it instantaneously, so you can get more writing much faster. And two is that you can get lots and lots of different options about what a piece of writing could look like. So you can say, produce me 100 different versions of this particular argument. So like, let's say, for example, I'm an NGO who wants to argue for regulating the police. I can use this tool to say, give me 100 different 1,000-word articles that argue for regulating the police, and then I can read them all and see what the best one is, which one speaks to people the most. That is where the actual delta in this debate is, and that is where we are going to win. We're going to explain why this gives so we're going to do this in three ways. Firstly, we're going to talk about political things. We're going to flip OO and explain how this actually gives an advantage to good actors who don't have many resources at the moment and who would not be able to do much writing at all in the absence of this technology. Secondly, we're going to talk about like more efficiency. So for example, when you can make better textbooks and stuff. Thirdly, we're going to talk about more creativity. So firstly, political things. So framing against OO. So I don't know why bad actors would use this more frequently than good actors. If Russia can use this to generate lots of bad information, then movements for minorities, for example, can use this to generate lots of good information. When I point this out in a POI, their response is, oh, Russia is a much larger actor than some like random NGO. Well, all that means is that in the status quo, Russia has a much greater ability to spread their information already than the random NGO does. However, I think that with regards to politics, we do actually get a delta, and it is one that favors Gov in two different ways. Firstly, like we get organizations that would not have the resources to generate writing now are able to. So you could be a very small NGO who doesn't have the money to hire the best writers, or who doesn't have the money to hire someone to edit that writing. Now they are able to produce writing in a way that they weren't able to before. Note that the delta is 0 for Russia because they could afford to hire people. But we think that minorities and marginalized actors, kind of by definition, are frequently strapped for resources. These are the most vulnerable members of society who don't have much money and who are like downtrodden and oppressed. And so with this tool can now produce writing cheaply and quickly in a way they wouldn't have been able to before. Secondly, you're just more able to pick the most powerful things. And the framing I want to do here is that I think most political questions, frankly, like don't have a right or wrong answer. Like there's no objective truth in the world. But what this allows people to do is like tell the AI, produce me 100 articles arguing for my position, and then they get to pick the most powerful one, which allows everyone to just get more persuasive content in the world. This is good because it means that it's no longer just the actors with just the best writers, but it's also every political position that gets to make the best case for themselves, meaning that society is more likely to come to the best conclusion when everyone has an opportunity to be persuaded by information. I unfortunately don't have time to take a POI, but my partner will take one. So second thing, like more efficiency in writing like technical things. So I think it is a big obstacle that currently people often have to write on a deadline. So for example, imagine like a law, for example, like in America, Trump's tax plan literally had like handwritten edits on the thing that people were voting for because people were writing on a deadline and didn't have time to do it. I think that by being able to produce writing instantaneously, you're more able to produce better technical things like laws, things like, technical manuals, like, how your car works, for example, things that like are really important to get right, but that people have to do on a deadline. And so it's hard to fix problems. What this allows us to do though, is to just produce a bunch of different versions of it. And then we read whoever's job it is to put it out, reads all of them and then sends out the best one. We think that this allows like all of these more technical things to be good in the world. And I want to talk about accountability real quick because I think this will be a clash. Like whoever makes the decision to like let this go out into the world is still going to be seen as accountable for it, because if they release something into the world that's like horribly like racist or whatever, or that has inaccuracies, people are going to say, hey, why did you allow this to be released? Why didn't you read it over first and then make sure it was good? So like that, this is not something that like is a unique delta, because even though the person didn't write it themselves, there still has to be someone who presses the button to say, let's send this into the world. That means people are likely to read it over first and make sure it's good before they send it out. Finally, creativity. So again, we just think you can produce way more art now, and like publishing companies can now produce way way more books or way more movie scripts and produce a lot more of them now that this expense is gone. This means that you get more great ideas in the world that captivate people because you can get things that a human would never have thought of, or maybe they would have, but they just didn't have enough time to write it out. And it gets more representation for minorities because at the point at which there's more art, you can produce more risky things because you have more art and you're like, hedging your bets at the point at which you're selling more things. And so representation goes up. By being able to produce tons and tons of writing really, really quickly, there are all sorts of benefits. We get better writing and like more of it is good. Proud to propose.
Thank you to the member of government.
The existence of more writing, of more books, of more synthesized research was not in itself a benefit, particularly when you contemplate precisely what it is this technology does, which again is the synthesizing of information that already exists. Meaning it is not as if this technology is used to make groundbreaking research to begin with. It's not as if it makes massive developments in artistry or in reporting. What it does is simply slightly more efficiently translate information that humans could have already produced, in slightly quicker and cheaper for companies. That itself was not a benefit, especially when you listen to elements of that closing government case, which accepts that there will be mass job losses that will occur as a consequence, especially when you consider as well that there's the potential for errors, which will be large when this technology is employed, when editorial and emotive perspectives are removed. What we are going to argue at closing opposition is relatively simple, which is that the small trade-off of efficiency is not worth the gargantuan risks, firstly, to humans generally, insofar as this would predicate mass job loss. Secondly, it is not worth the accountability issues that this technology could risk. But thirdly, it is not worth the potential future consequences of employing such technology, which could be used in ways nefarious to humans. 3 extensions. Firstly, on efficiency. Second, accountability. Thirdly, on why this might turn life into a meaningless endeavor. Firstly, with respect to efficiency, I want to point out 2 things here. I firstly think that the efficiency that particularly opening government seems to predicate their case on is one that they don't actually attain particularly well. That is because they concede that this technology is prone to errors and moreover analyze that it requires oversight. How much oversight is actually required is probably the question that's particularly important. But secondarily, because as we point out in the point of information, the checking mechanisms of this technology and whether it's doing the right thing is fucking rubbish, because the humans who would comb through the papers to see if the technology has made an error now no longer work in those industries and now no longer actually read the papers to begin with. So it's hard to identify where an error occurs in the first place. And when we point this out in a point of information, the only response we get is a circular response, which is simply, well, this technology gets better. How the fuck does the technology get better if the researchers who are behind it don't read over the information that will be required to actually pick up on an error being made in the first place? Moreover, at the point where the technology is able to produce acceptable articles that does have errors contained with it, and at the point where those errors aren't picked up by humans and fixed within the technology, then the technology itself probably develops heuristics, say, in which case it continuously pumps out research that might not actually be particularly useful. So either this opening government team doesn't get the efficiency they need because they need so many people having oversight of these systems, or they release a system that has the propensity to unleash research that might be inaccurate, that might not be fully correct, all in the name of a bit of efficiency for big corporations, obviously something that wasn't worth it. But secondly, let's grapple with whether what occurs at the point where efficiency is actually earned, which again is the primary benefit of this opening government team. Note that efficiency in and of itself was something that was relatively undesirable in many circumstances. Firstly, because this would predicate enormous job loss, particularly in any writing industries. The scale of that harm was extraordinary. That was things like journalism, researchers, teachers, marketing, any sort of political writing job people might have, they're now removed from. Note those industries were extraordinarily important because people often had editorial perspectives there that were unique from what was being put out in the mainstream. At the point where you lose a lot of those researchers, then that was obviously a massive harm. OG tried to get around this in their case by suggesting that no, this would just be used as a helping tool for individuals, in which case, if no one's losing their job, again, I don't think they get the efficiency that they're arguing for. But secondly, no, obviously it won't just be a fucking checking tool. At the point where corporations have spent probably millions, billions of dollars even producing this technology, they're not going to just keep around all their low-level researchers or graduate employees just because they're nice guys. Obviously, they'll fucking sack a lot of them en masse. They'll be absolutely fucking stupid not to do so. And consequently, you get massive gaps that occur in writing fields, which was particularly harmful because you probably got less diversity of thought broadly, particularly when you consider the sorts of individuals who are going to be employing this technology. That is to say, the Murdoch media probably just becomes more and more biased because there are less perspectives that are represented there. The second thing to note as to why efficiency wasn't that important was particularly with respect to research, which again is a major contention of this government bench. Note that research is particularly important, that low-level researchers or adjuncts actually do their job firstly slowly because they can probably contemplate more things that will be generated for new research in the future, but secondly, that they have an understanding of the information that they are producing because it is that understanding that will actually likely result in new research being come out in the future. That is to say, again, the only benefit this government bench gets is research that is currently been done being synthesized, and to the extent that we can now point out that this might come at the expense of future research individuals perform because those individuals themselves have less understanding of their fields, then that is an extraordinary harm that wasn't worth it for the efficiency that, again, open government probably doesn't need yet. Second thing I want to talk about is with respect to accountability. And this is something that directly engages far more with closing government. I think there are four big issues with respect to accountability in this debate. Firstly, we think things like the defamation of individuals or the releasing of information that is faulty with respect to erroneous research that we suggest might be likely to happen is uniquely harmful at the point where it is produced by like a technological force, by a robot as opposed to a human. That is to say, when a human defames an individual in an article, you can obviously identify the individual who's written that article and hold them directly to account. It's far harder to do such for a robot. Moreover, at the point where they do it instantaneously, it's probably relatively harsh to just challenge this directly against or level any claims directly against, say, the publishing company that's in charge of that. So, you obfuscate sort of grounds of accountability, and that was bad. But secondly, as we point out in a point of information, this technology has the propensity to become extraordinarily toxic. I agree with closing government that all of the argumentation in this debate so far is relatively symmetrical, but it's symmetrical in a way that is harmful for the government bench. That is to say, to break the symmetricality clash, we'll note that the existence of a good paper doesn't fucking disprove the existence of a bad paper, especially when people might only consume the bad paper, especially when algorithms often favor things that are extraordinarily controversial. It's extremely likely the bad things will reign supreme. Opening.
Yeah, so if you've worked out in prep that the technology is error prone, I reckon people who run billion-dollar corporations also know this is probably why they don't sack people en masse, and you don't meet your burden of proving that this is worse than the comparative of human research that you have to stand over.
But these were the two circumstances that I suggested occur. So either you don't sack people en masse, in which case you don't actually get the efficiency that the entirety of your case actually relies on, or you do probably sack people as closing government suggests, and that was something that's particularly abysmal, especially at the point where it came at the expense of other research occurring. It was not simultaneously true that this open government team claim they get more efficiency, but secondarily that they also were able to, not sack workers en masse. You had to pick one. Going back to accountability, no, you also just obfuscate other accountability measures. You get less employees. That was probably something that was bad because you get less perspectives on authorship. But fourthly, insofar as there's a big symmetricality claim that comes from closing government in particular, with respect to Russia already has the propensity to do things like post toxic content. Yes, they do, but now they can do it instantaneously and back it up with facts in a way that is particularly pernicious. Final thing, extraordinarily quickly, this has the potential to make life meaningless, and this responds directly to what closing government say with respect to the production of art. No, this would just mean people can enter their preferences into things. They hook themselves up to fucking pleasure domes effectively. They no longer engage with any content that is likely to be truly meaningful because they're just able to get drip-fed content that is precisely that which they want to see. For those reasons, it's clear. Closing opposition.
Okay, a few things in the speech. First, on closing opposition. Second, on opening opposition. Finally, on why we come above open OO, but that'll fall under OG, but that'll fall under OO probably. So, closing opposition, what do they tell us? A few things. First, I want to tackle the issue of job loss directly. They tell us that we're going to lose a bunch of jobs and that this is going to be an issue because people are going to be out of work and so on. But there's a few issues with this claim, 3 specifically. The first is that you're going to have more money in order to hire more people because businesses are much more efficient because they're saving a lot of money from the fact that they don't have to hire people to write things, so they're able to make more profits because their costs go down. So they use that money to hire more people to do other things. Insofar as businesses probably have an incentive to hire people because they want to make profit and they want to grow their business, there's going to be hiring in either world. But on our side of the house, that money is just shifted towards hiring other people. So I think that there's still going to be more jobs on our side of the house. The other thing to note is that, the other thing to note is that you're going to have, sorry, I think it is, sorry. The other thing to note is that you're going to have more creative jobs that are going to exist. This is part of our case where we tell you that now people have the ability to write things when they otherwise didn't have access to writers to publish them in the first place. We say that you have more people that are able to be like artists to some extent, more people that are able to be like investigative journalists, or more people to be able to have their opinionated people be able to publish their work when they're now have the capability to write it much more efficiently. So you're going to have much more creative expression on our side of the house when it's much easier to actually get the final product out the door, which happens because you can have a bunch of different versions generated at once and find the best, most persuasive one. And also just the writing process becomes much more faster when you input whatever you want the writing to say. And so we're going to have more creative jobs. The third thing to note is that someone still has to read these papers. They tell you on their side of the house, no one's going to read them. But insofar as no publisher wants to put out something bad, if Harvard puts out a press release that has a bunch of errors in it, it'll be seen as a huge embarrassment. So in as far as publishers don't want to be embarrassed, don't want to be seen as bad writers, they're going to have an incentive to hire people to actually read these things. So you're still going to have lots of people reading through all these things. That's also, it still saves money because reading is much easier, faster, and cheaper than writing in the first place. So that's why we're going to get more jobs on our side of the house. And even if they do have some job loss, it's marginal and in the long run will outweigh. I'll take OO quickly.
Given that companies have incentives to pay dividends to their shareholders and also other fixed payments like expenses, loans, and taxes, this likely means that it will be not cheap enough for angels to be able to buy it. But even if they buy it, who has more influence and money? Conservative elites and authoritarian regimes, or the NGOs that you're talking about?
Okay, a few things to know. First, the motion literally says that this is going to be rapidly expanded within the future. It's already being expanded right now. Certain news organizations could use it. You can use it right now if you go look up online, like AI speech language generator, because it's a program. Anyone can program a program. And since there's going to be many different programs, I'm sure that one will be leaked online, or people have an incentive to release it widespread. It's a very easy thing to release overall. We have translators that are now common because they have incentive to give it away to everyone. The motion says everyone's going to be able to use it. But specifically on bad actors versus good actors, we tell you that those who have the least resources are going to be the ones who are now more likely to be able to spread their types of speech. This is part of our case. We tell you that those who are underprivileged, underrepresented, marginalized, don't have as many resources as those who are in positions of power, don't have as many resources as those that are in governments or large organizations that have much money. We tell you that those organizations with much less money, less people they can hire, people that have much less resources to write actual things and the time to write it and have people actually publish it. We tell you that those people with the least resources are the ones who are able to actually write much more on our side of the house, which is why when there's more writing, it tends to favor those who are underrepresented and underprivileged because they were the ones who did not have the resources in the first place. A sophisticated misinformation campaign from a right-wing organization is going to have those resources in either way because they have right-wing donors which have a lot of money to pump into this. On our side of the house, we get much more people who are underrepresented giving their ideas and spreading them throughout the world. That's why we're going to get on net a benefit from those good actors. But then the next thing we hear from closing opposition is that there's going to be and the last thing to note about job loss is that people that are researchers, people that are investigative journalists, people that are technologists or so on, they're still going to have their job because you still need people to do the investigative research. New York Times is not going to fire the people that do the investigative research, that come up with the info in the first place, that have the confidential sources, because that is something that this program cannot do. This program cannot do the research itself. It can synthesize research, but the benefit that news organizations have is that they have journalists who go investigate these things in the first place. Those jobs cannot be replaced, and so they're still going to have a place there, and so there's still going to be research in us from the house. The other thing they say is there's going to be defamation. there's going to be defamation and misinformation. But one, you can still hold the publisher accountable. Whoever publishes the information is still going to be the one that's ultimately accountable for what's said. So even if you say, like, there's no author attached to it, you're still going to hold, like, for example, the New York Times, the Economist, or whatever is publishing it accountable. The second thing is like, probably going to be more incentive to hold these things accountable, because insofar as people don't like defamation and want to solve problems, there's probably going to be more laws that say, like, whatever you publish, you're accountable for that has defamation, even if you didn't write it directly. So this is an issue that can easily be solved through simple regulation. That is why CEO is out of this debate, and so on. Quickly. OO says a few arguments. The first is that there's going to be bias, but one, the people who write these things have the biases that they infect into it because they feed it the information and the arguments in order to produce. But two, it corrects for probably bias because it synthesizes a large amount of information so it can find the most reliable ones, the ones that are cited the most, while random people who are writing this probably insert their own biases without even knowing it. This program probably can filter it out much better and actually make sure that individual biases are not infecting it. The next thing to note is that there's going to be lack of regulation. This doesn't matter to the point where you don't need to regulate things based on how it's written. You regulate it on where it's written. So, example, if you use this program to like write 30,000 papers but publish them all on Reddit, no one cares. No one needs to regulate it. But if you put a shit out on, like, I don't know, a major news organization or a platform that is like respected or people read it, you're going to have regulation there anyway. And those regulation is done through programs and AI. It's not done through individuals reading every single thing. So the regulation thing just does not matter at all. But finally, they say it's going to be used for bad. The first thing we tell you is, and I would like to note that, the first thing to tell you is that, one, it's non-comparative because the people who want to push out bad things are going to do it either way. Speed does not matter at the point at which people are not going to trust you, because you're not going to suddenly have a more trustworthy URL. You're not going to have it, like, you're not going to trust something that's not written by a respectable source anyway. It just means that unrespectable sources have maybe 50%, 20%, to 100% more articles, but no one's going to read them anyway. But good guys, or the second thing is that, people are still not going to trust them, so it's not respected. But finally, good content's going to be outweighing this because A, it's probably a wash. They can't prove that there's more bad sources than good sources. We already proved to you why underrepresented people are going to be empowered more. But B, we probably tell you that like fact checks and things like that go up much more on our side of the house. And so at the point at which more people read respected news than unrespected news, they're still going to benefit our side of the house. CO does not respond to just most of our case. When we tell you that they're going to have more underrepresented voices represented within their writing, which means people have more access to different opinions and different choices in society, which gives them more agency. But we also tell you that creativity goes up because more art can be created, more good news can be created, and more things like books, which means that like life is more valuable, which responds to CO's last point. For these reasons, we are very proud to propose.
Thank you to the government whip for that speech. I'd now like to invite the opposition whip. You are a bit faint.
A bit faint. Whether or not these machines can research, and OG can't decide how accurate they are. And I think the harm there for this debate is that the other teams, have a lot of questions about whether you get, more efficiency or more articles or more writers per se. But I don't think they ever really strike at the core of this debate, which is it actually a good thing to have more efficiency? Is it a good thing to have this mass of articles? Is it a good thing to have, just millions of pieces of content at the tap of a finger? We told you uniquely at CO that it probably wasn't. I'm going to do two things in this debate. Firstly, I will get to the heart of the debate and discuss whether or not greater efficiency of writing is actually a benefit, which I think takes down a lot of the material we hear from the Gov bench. And then I'll talk about what kind of writing this AI is likely to produce and whether the Gov teams can claim, the small benefits apart from efficiency that they do try to claim. Okay, is greater efficiency of writing a benefit? And no, I think that this overcomes the symmetricality of the opening half, because if we can prove that, it is to an extent true that you do get a lot more writing, but that is a bad thing, I think that co-ops the supposed benefit of OG really successfully. The claim that is made at OG is that many people, have too much writing work to do at the moment, and that this would make writing more efficient. I think there are two problems with this argument. The first thing is it relies on a really weird characterization of efficiency, because they concede at PM that there is a substantial risk of errors and bias and that this requires oversight. But this oversight presumably needs to be relatively detailed because things like biases can be quite deeply embedded. And also note, it's just sort of unclear how this works. You know, how do you detect a bias if you have not read the source material? I think the response to that POI was pretty woeful. All we heard is just that, like, you know, we hope it's accurate because we can develop the technology over time, which doesn't really, you know, get away from the errors that occur while the technology is still being developed. But also the structural reason why there are errors is just that this machine can't think, it can't interpret, it can only summarize, you know, material and make statistical predictions about which words should follow other words. And so I think then, you know, the claim that you get this mass production of articles is probably overstated in the first instance. I think the government probably runs into a bit of an issue there. But I think the second thing to say is labor-saving devices, you know, aren't necessarily good, and that was for let's see, 6 reasons. Firstly, we would say that the writing market is actually pretty saturated. Like, there's a lot of unemployed writers out there. We think that generally people would probably prefer to have to send some emails to their boss than to lose their job in things like copywriting, journalism, and so on. And we think to an extent this was conceded at CG. And, you know, the response that we get in a POI from OG is like, well, you know, if companies know there are errors, why would they fire all of their workforce? A few things to say here. Firstly, if there are errors and they don't fire their workforce, it's sort of unclear that you get that much of an efficiency benefit. But also just obviously not everyone's employed in research. This would affect people like copywriters or local journalism, where it actually probably isn't a huge problem for the companies if there are, you know, some methodological errors there. We think the cost saving would probably outweigh that. I think the second thing to say, though, is that by speeding up production, you do not actually necessarily save labor in the sense that you no longer have to send, you know, emails to your boss. You probably just increase the expectations on workers because corporations can now just get away with being like, well, you've saved this labor, so now, you know, spend 9 hours a day working on something else. And we would also just say that there are probably better ways to deal with toxic work culture. So we don't think that would get OG all that far in this debate. The third thing to say is that people just really enjoy writing. It provides a lot of meaning in people's lives. A lot of people who are currently employed in writing do like it, even if it's not the fancy investigative journalism that CG seems to admire. And so we thought it was probably a bad thing if people were doing less of that kind of thing, you know, which made their life meaningful, which was often their life's work. The fourth thing to say is people genuinely thinking and understanding their work seems like a massive benefit. We thought, given that OG seemed to, like, you know, it suggests like students would be cheating with this, or like researchers would be able to skip doing their readings. That was probably a harmful thing because it meant that people understood their work in less complex and meaningful ways. The fifth thing to say is that information overload is probably a bad thing, because if it is true that you have mass production of articles and mass production of information, that was much harder to process and harder to hold accountable. So it's unclear, firstly, how that would go in terms of influencing policy and stuff like that. Like, someone presumably has to read all of this information, but also, you know, if you have such a huge flux of information, you know, tracking it down and keeping it accountable seems difficult. I think the final thing to say with regards to creativity is obviously that at the point where you can just create content with the click of a button, that was a relatively meaningless process. It didn't contain a lot of emotional value or a lot of hard work for people, which was probably sad. What are the responses we hear to this job loss material from CG? They tell us 3 things. Firstly, they say now companies have more money to hire people, but they don't explain what those people are actually doing. If I am a local newspaper and I can now fire my workers, I now just have more profits. Like, it's sort of unclear, what am I hiring them to do? Not explained, sorry. The next thing they tell us is that, well, now you have more creative jobs, but this doesn't make any sense at all, because they don't really explain, you know, why there is more demand for those creative jobs. They sort of claim that you get more creative jobs because now you can pump out the product quicker, but that's done by machines, so where's the job coming from? But finally, it wasn't really explained why being an investigative journalist was better than being a regular journalist. We'd say that the regular journalists probably still did just want to keep their jobs. And the final thing they tell us is that you still have editors, which is mitigatory at best. We thought writing was a fun and valuable pursuit as well as editing. So that can't claw back victory, I suppose, on this idea. I'll take a point from closing now.
Okay, so for your first point, yeah, we think the writing will be full of errors. That's why you hire people to read it, meaning that jobs still exist and people are still getting paid, and the companies can pay people to do like literally lots of other things, like be investigative journalists. That's what they do for the newspaper.
Okay, that's 15 seconds. But also, hello, if you have to hire a bunch of people to look over this error-ridden text, you get none of your benefits for NGOs. Like, I don't understand why the government doesn't see the trade-off here. It is either good writing or you get your efficiency gains. they can't coexist, sorry. All right, what kind of writing is this actually producing? I think dealing with a little bit of nitty-gritty from GovBench, so Closing Government's main claim is just that people can use this to create articles en masse, and that's good because it'll be NGOs. I think this is unclear that it will be that effective. Like, this can't think, it doesn't know how to be persuasive, it knows how to collate information and put words after each other. We thought an NGO would probably be better off hiring people with lived experience who could write persuasively and emotionally about their experiences. We thought that that was probably better also for those marginalized people who now had a job. Also, this is an incredibly marginal benefit because it's unclear that NGOs would be winning socially if they just wrote more articles. But finally, they tell us that these AIs can't do research, so we don't know how well they can write the articles in the first place. OG's claim is about research, and I think this is probably a bit better, although it is sadly knifed by CG. But I think this mistakes the way that research works, because it is not true that literature reviews, like I've done them, you don't just read the conclusion of the article, and if you did, that would be methodologically bad. You would miss a lot of the nuance of the paper. You would be unable to make estimations as to the value of the paper. And so we thought, even if this was true, this was actually a harm. It made research far worse. Because we thought this AI could not understand the information it was processing, it could not have moral thoughts and judgments about the information it was processing. It would be awful if this AI cut costs, cut jobs, and broadly made society worse. So proud to negate.